Thank you for being here to the group. I want to talk to you today about the elections that have just concluded, and I'm going to talk about it both in terms of what I saw happening federally and what I saw happening here in Louisiana, and finally the East Baton Rouge Parish implications of the elections. So first, let's talk about the federal aspect. One of the things which I think is important to realize is this was a very high turnout election, and the high turnout was something that had manifested itself all the way back to the Iowa caucus, with the small exception of a few contests that were held right after the pandemic started in March. In general, we had high turnout throughout the year, and this election is definitely going to break some records. More specifically, as we speak right now, we're talking about 149.5 million who have voted already, and that's compared to 137 million who voted in the 2016 presidential elections. And given that you have, according to my latest estimate, 10 to 15 more million votes to be counted and posted, we're easily going to be looking at, in my opinion, 160 million. The other aspect of the high turnout, which I think is important mentioning this morning, is the fact that you had a record number of early voters. In other words, early voting that is something that was first introduced several decades ago, has gradually gained popularity. And this year, unlike all other election years, it actually cracked 100 million a couple days before Election Day. And at last count from what I had on Tuesday afternoon, I showed that we had 104 million early votes. Here in Louisiana, it was 986,000, which was almost double what it was 4 years ago. So the fact that you have this many people early voting in the midst of a pandemic is something that I think that we as Americans should be proud of. And as we speak, that is even with the 10 to 15 million votes that I see are left to be counted, we have had percentage-wise the highest turnout for any presidential election since 1968. And since those extra votes will certainly put us over the top, we may end up looking at the highest turnout easily in the last 100 years. So that's something which I think is certainly impressive, is the fact that you had an election that so many Americans were passionate voting in. Now, a couple of things I'd like to mention about the election itself, rather than rehash the state by state of all the results between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The two things which I think are worth mentioning from a federal perspective is this. Number one, suburbs and independents matter. Because what had happened was President Trump had underperformed relative to other Republican candidates in well-educated and/or suburban areas in 2016, and that performance further declined in 2020. And if you were to look at county by county returns in states like Georgia or Pennsylvania or Michigan that were relatively close elections, and you compared the suburban results between 2016 and 2020, you would undoubtedly see a drop in the Trump margin and or a rise in the Biden margin. And when you're talking about as many states that were closely divided as there were in this election, that drop in suburban support is something which I think the Republicans do need to take notice of. But this was not, however, a Democratic landslide like the 2008 elections were. For one thing, when the final vote is counted, I believe that the results will be something along the lines of 51% for Joe Biden and 47% for President Donald Trump, which is eerily reminiscent of the elections in 2012 when Barack Obama defeated Mitt Romney by a similar margin. The other aspect of there not being an electoral mandate is that in 2008, Democrats picked up about 10 seats in the Senate and about 20 more seats in the House. So they went in to the Obama administration with solid legislative majorities in both chambers. That did not happen this year. The Democrats thus far have only gained a net of one Senate seat. I think it's unlikely that they'll retake the majority, although you do have, of the unsettled races, two of them we won't know about until January because of a Georgia law requiring that a candidate get 50% of the vote on Election Day. So those two Republican-held seats we won't even know about until January 5th. There's a couple other uncalled races, which I think the Republicans will take. But point being is the Democrats made very small gains in the Senate. And even more important, they lost a net of 5 seats in the United States House of Representatives, which meant that 8 Democratic seats were lost and the Democrats picked up 3 Republican seats. If you're looking at the 8 Democrats who have thus far lost their reelection, all but 1 were freshmen, which to me means that you had Democratic freshmen in 2018 who were elected promising moderation, and voters did not perceive that that was the case once they got into office. So 8 of them lost reelection, and I predict there'll easily be 3 to 5 more when the votes are finally counted. But the bigger takeaway when you're talking about what I see as a lack of a Democratic mandate was I went through all 435 House races to see what the Democratic margin, the margin was rather of the Democratic candidates who were victorious. I counted 48 Democratic winners who won with less than 55% of the vote. What that means in plain English is since midterm elections are historically more hostile to the party in power, that Joe Biden better be careful about losing the Democratic House majority in 2022, particularly when you're talking about 48 victorious Democrats who won by such a narrow margin. Now, I'm certainly not saying that all 48 will lose, but I am saying that those 48 have to be very careful about how they vote with regards to, do they adhere more to the centrist path, or do they take a more progressive path, which Barack Obama and the Democrats did in 2009 and 2010, and it cost them heavily. So those are my takeaways from the presidential election. Now I'd like to segue into the state elections, and then, of course, finish up talking about here Baton Rouge. So thus far for the state of Louisiana, we had record turnout, which was easily 100,000 more than what it was in the 2016 elections. We're sitting at 69.4% turnout. One of the things I like to caution you with regards to assuming that's the final turnout number, we do have some provisional ballots that are yet to come in. More specifically, we only have provisionals that have been reported in 10 out of 64 parishes when I last checked. Those are people who were possibly unable to vote because of eligibility questions, but they're being allowed to cast a ballot with the understanding that their eligibility will be checked after Election Day. So you have that vote. The other aspect of the vote, too, which will increase the turnout, is that you always have undervotes, meaning that there'll be people who skipped voting in every single race. They may have voted in the local races and not voted in president, or vice versa. So that'll easily be some additional votes. I'm of the opinion that we should hit 70% turnout when all is said and done and the Secretary of State certifies the results. Now, the other thing that's important to realize when we're talking about not just the record turnout, we had a record early vote, which of course I'd alluded to before. We had 531,000 people early vote 4 years ago. And the last time I checked, it's 986,000. And equally as important as that large volume is the fact that 46% of Louisianians cast their vote before Election Day, which is unheard of. And for comparison's sake, 26% voted early in the 2016 presidential election, which back then was a record. And then in the gubernatorial runoff last November, that 26% became 33%, which again was a record. Well, now we're talking about 46% of the vote was cast early. And I'm of the opinion that even though there were special circumstances which pushed that number as high as it was from a percentage standpoint, that overall the trend is for more and more people to be interested in early voting in Louisiana as time goes on. So in addition to the early vote, I think it's also important to mention that Republicans had a great night statewide, and that not only did President Trump carry the state by 18 points, which was pretty close to what it was in 2016, Senator Bill Cassidy, despite there being a crowded field, he was reelected by a larger percentage than what President Trump received in 2020, this year, rather. All 5 Republican incumbents, 4 of the 5 Republican incumbents were easily reelected. The 1 Democratic incumbent, Richmond, was reelected easily. So in other words, there were no runoffs in those races. The only runoff there is right now is the 5th Congressional District up in Northeast Louisiana and in the Florida parishes. At the present time, it looks like it'll be a 2 Republican runoff, But of course, there needs to be some recounting of the votes to make sure that a Democrat named Candy Kristoff does not overtake Lance Harris for the right to be the second place finisher. But right now, I'm saying that it's going to be a 2 Republican runoff in the 5th district. And either way, regardless of who Luke Letlow faces in the runoff, and he, by the way, was Congressman Abraham's chief of staff and ran first in the primary. Regardless of who he faces in the runoff, I do believe he is in a strong position to win in December. So that's the statewide results. Now, getting to East Baton Rouge Parish, however, that was the notable blue exception to the otherwise red tide that in the statewide results. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton carried this parish by 9 points. Joe Biden increased that lead even more to a 56-42 lead, which is pretty strong, and I think is indicative of a fact that you did have a substantial population of voters in South Baton Rouge who are more well-educated, they're affluent, and they did not cotton to the Trump type of Republicanism, even though they had no problems voting for Garrett Graves and voting for Senator Bill Cassidy. So East Baton Rouge Parish, like I said, we moved to the left while the rest of the state stayed heavily Republican. And that presidential vote, by the way, sets the stage for the runoff that we will have for mayor, for Metro Council, several Metro Council seats, and a couple judgeships. The thing that's most important when we're talking about the mayoral race in December, or the runoff in December, is that, in my opinion, Mayor Broome is in a strong electoral position. More specifically, what I'm talking about here is that Joe Biden carried the parish with 56% of the vote. And if you were to add up the vote that Mayor Broome and Denise Marcel received, they received 55% of the vote. So to assume that Mayor Broome would be in electoral trouble in December, you'd have to assume that there would be either A, a substantial fall off in black turnout in December, or B, that Steve Carter might be able to take some of the vote that supported Denise Marcel on election day. So like I said, Mayor Broome, in my opinion, starts off in a good position for the December runoff, but of course she has to treat this election seriously, as would anybody else forced into runoff. But she did finish first with 48% of the vote, which in itself is an impressive accomplishment, considering she had several substantial opponents. And she did win a respectable percentage of the white vote, which is the other part worth mentioning when we're talking about her impressive primary showing and, in my opinion, her strong positioning for the runoff. So those are my thoughts about the presidential, statewide, and local elections, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
All right, John, we in chat, we had from William Lewis, why do you think there are another 10 million votes to be counted on the national scene?
Right, the reason there's 10 million votes to be counted is this. We do not have all 50 states having election day voting. Many states have a substantial mail-in component to their voting, number one, and unlike Louisiana that has very strict rules about when those when those mail votes have to be turned in, which is the day before election day in general, other states have more generous allowances, as in either a postmark by election day, or this year several states allowed multiple days of ballots to come in, which will be counted as long as they have a November 3rd postmark. To give you one extreme example, the state of California, they're allowing ballots to come in up to 17 days after election day, so long as they have that November 3rd postmark. And the other part of the equation too is you have rules in various states like New York and Ohio, where if you have absentee balloting or provisional balloting, they will not even open up those votes to be counted until a specified number of days after election day, and they don't do partial releases. So when you mentioned about the fact that, or you allow for the reality that other states are much more lenient as to when their mail-in votes can come in addition to the fact that you have some states that are sitting on absentee ballots that they're not going to count until later this week or even after that, all of that together contributes to the 10 to 15 million extra votes to be counted that I've talked about. In other words, and this is a point that I wish to emphasize strongly because there has been chatter on the other side, which I think is simply untrue. These are validly cast votes. It's just a case of they've not been tallied yet, but these are votes that are thus far validly cast. It's just a case of when the states can get around to processing them and including them in their tallies.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Sam Carlin with the Advocate. How
Yes.
much of Louisiana's early and mail vote was a cannibalization of election day vote?
Yes, and the way I would look at that question is this. We have an incremental increase of about 450,000 early votes relative to what it was in 2016. We also did some things that caused that increased early voting. Specifically, we increased the number of the days of early voting from 7 to 10. We allowed some additional exceptions for who could vote by mail. More people on their own chose to vote by mail because they did not want to be in a super spreader event. My estimate at the very minimum is early voting was consistently running about 80,000 a day. And given that we had 3 extra days to early vote, I think that you could automatically say that most of that 240,000 was a cannibalization, that they probably would have voted on election day anyway, because I don't think we would have had the capacity to handle all that 240,000 in 7 days.
All right, thank you. William Lewis had another question. He says about the 10 million. If there are 10 million votes to be counted, was the election called too early?
No, because you have to remember, and by the way, I call elections for for Channel 33, and I've done so since the 2015 elections. Once you get an idea of how the vote is coming in from certain areas and you know what's left to count, you could pretty much call a race. In other words, this idea that you have to have 100% of the vote in to be counted it's a silly notion, number one, and number two, it's not actually accurately representative of the facts. And so keep in mind that when we're talking about the 10 million, let's see, there's 3.5 million in California. That's obviously going to be Democratic regardless of when you call it. There's another 1.5 million in New York, again, Democratic regardless of how you call it. About 500,000 in New Jersey. In other words, what I'm talking about here is you have a huge volume of these votes when I'm talking about the 10 million that's coming from states that how they'll be called is not in doubt. So my opinion, given the public right to know, there's certainly nothing wrong with calling those votes, unless, of course, there were close races, which, of course, is the case in Arizona, where the jury is still out about whether Fox News did the right thing in calling the race when they did.
All right, thank you. And I had a question. Let's go back to Georgia for a few minutes and
Yes.
talk about the 2 senators and what their chances are, and explain what that law is up there that allowed this to happen so late. Elaborate on it a bit, please.
Okay, repeat the question.
Well, can you tell us more about the Georgia situation with the Senate runoff and who the 2 senators are and
Sure.
and why that quirk in the law happened?
So the state of Georgia requires in a general election situation, well, primary situation too, but especially in general election, you have to have 50.0% of the vote to win. So what happened this year was one senator, a gentleman named Johnny Isaacson, he resigned early for health reasons. So that created a special election where it was basically an open primary situation like what we have here in Louisiana. And so given that it was a crowded open primary, of course, nobody was going to win a majority on election night. So that's the first seat. The second seat was an incumbent named David Perdue, who was elected in 2014. Not only did he face John Ossoff, but he faced a libertarian. And the spread between Senator Perdue and Ossoff was about 2 points, and the libertarian received about 2.5 points. And since Senator Perdue finished with under 50%, that libertarian's presence on the ballot forced a runoff because Senator Perdue did not get 50.0% of the vote.
All right, thank you, John. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I see that Press Club member Barry Mealy has one. He says, John, how significant is this vote switching software developed by, I believe, the CIA that is called Hammer that retired Air Force General McInerney has mentioned in the media and that the Obama administration and now the Biden campaign used to switch votes. Are you
No,
familiar with that?
number one, I'm not. Number two, I do not engage in idle speculation like that. And number three, if in fact there is such software, it is incumbent upon the Republicans to bring it to light and present the evidence. Because one of the things that I'm personally uncomfortable with are these doubts that are being sowed about the legitimacy of the election without substantive proof. And if in fact there is such software, then it is incumbent upon the Republicans or whoever to bring that forward. So personally, I don't engage in such idle speculation, nor would I even, with all due respect, entertain the thought of this being a decisive factor. Because there's another thing too, besides the fact that I don't like engaging in idle speculation. Unlike, say, the 2000 presidential election, which truly hinged on one state and 500 votes, we're talking about multiple states here that could put Joe Biden over the top. And so if this software, which I don't believe is the case, but if this software had influenced a substantive number of votes, it would have to have happened in multiple states. And these states were not 500 vote margin states like what Florida was in 2000. So that's kind of my
Okay.
thoughts on that.
All right. Well, thank you. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any on the screen, so we certainly appreciate your coming. Do you have any closing comments?
Well, I think that this has been an interesting election season. And if, let's pretend for a millisecond, I were giving the Biden administration any advice, I would give him two pieces of advice. Number one, the coronavirus pandemic needs to be taken care of. Number two, I would not try to construe this election as having a decisive mandate like what Barack Obama did in 2008. Therefore, you need to pursue a cautious centrist path and not think that you can push through progressive legislation because, for one, you do not have a secure margin in the House. And number two, you're more likely than not going to have a Senate majority. So you have to temper your expectations, is what I'm saying.
All right. Well, thank you, John. That was a good presentation and brought us a lot more knowledge. And we'll look forward to the press club, the press club of Baton Rouge, getting together again before too long. And thank you for your contribution today.
Anytime. My pleasure.
That will conclude our meeting. Thank you.